Okay, let's begin with today's lecture is creative design versus intelligent design. How many have heard of the intelligent design movement? Okay, I like a lot of their arguments. Most of them are from the biological sciences, so I'm more familiar with them and so forth. And I think the reason I like their arguments, because myself personally, I don't understand how someone with a PhD in genetics, for example, can believe in what's called the mutation selection theory of how evolution occurred, which of course is called neo-Darwinism. And if you think about it, the more they study about genetics, the more we know about cell biology, the more impossible random mutations and natural selection as a mechanism can be. And that's the root of the intelligent design movement. So, of course, the intelligent design movement is not new. The intelligent design, well, the movement itself, as we know it, is from about the 1990s, but the idea of design is not a new concept. Back early, even contemporary with Darwin, there was a theologian named William Pauly, and of course he talked about the evidence for design that we see in things that people have made, and of course he talked about a watchmaker. If you find a watch, you would just assume that somebody made the watch. And of course, living things are much more complex than even a watch. So what I want to talk about, I want to turn it around and call it creative design. But the idea of design is not a new concept, even though the intelligent design movement kind of is a newer thing. However, we are not intelligent design proponents because intelligent design completely leaves God out of the picture. We're going to call it creative design. So the creative design argument that we're going to present in the last section of this class deals with the idea that all things were designed by the Creator, the God of the Bible. If you know anything about the intelligent design movement, you know they dance all around the issue of who is the designer. And that, of course, is offensive to us as Christians. So I believe in creative design. Everything was designed by God and the God of the Bible. Two key points that I want you to see in this argument would be that, first of all, God's hand in nature, God's design in nature is obvious. Okay? It's obvious that everything we see around us was designed by God, an infinite God. Now, the intelligent design movement says that it's obvious there was some form of intelligence behind everything we see in nature. And that, of course, is offensive to us as Christians because we know who the designer is. And the fact that they're not giving God credit should be very offensive to you. And then the second part is that design fulfills purpose. Especially in the animal kingdom, there are some very odd animals, okay, that kind of defy our classification skills. But those animals are designed for their habitat, and the features that they have, the colors that they may display, were all designed for a purpose. So, creative design versus intelligent design. Let's go ahead and I think we could make Job 12:7-9 our theme verse. Okay, I like this verse because it's maybe a little bit sarcastic. Okay, you can see Job 12:7. But ask now the beast, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee. Or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Who knoweth not in all these things that the hand of God hath wrought this? So, our answer to intelligent design is just look around. Yes, it's obvious that things were designed, but who designed them? All we have to do is look at the animal kingdom. All we have to do is look at birds. All we have to do is look at the earth, which we did in our last section. And God's hand is obvious. You're probably more familiar with Psalms 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. But I especially want you to pay attention to Job 12, because we are going to spend some time, we're going to ask the fowls of the air, Okay, and we're going to spend some time on what I'm calling avian design. And there's so many other things, but I just like to pick the birds. Here's the intelligent design argument. Okay, the intelligent design argument tells us that unguided natural processes cannot account for the biological complexity and diversity in nature. Okay, this is the crux of their argument. And you'll notice that it is a negative argument only, as in, this doesn't work. They don't have an alternative. This is a negative argument. So, unguided natural processes, that would be, of course, naturalism. We cannot evoke the supernatural as a cause. So, unguided natural processes cannot account for the biological complexity and diversity. Well, if you step back from that argument for a minute and think about it, what does account for biological complexity and diversity? The infinite creator. Though the intelligent design movement will not say that. So the unguided natural processes cannot account for the biological complexity and diversity that we see all around us. And again, that is a negative argument. They're not proposing another mechanism, and they're not saying who the designer would be. Here are two main arguments that we are going to borrow and expand and learn from the intelligent design movement. Irreducible complexity and specified complexity. You'll notice on your syllabus that we're going to spend a whole day on irreducible complexity, and we actually are going to spend another whole day on specified complexity, which is the argument that William Dembski has expanded upon, and we're going to deal with what he calls his design inference. All right, so there's the intelligent design argument. We're going to spend some time today talking about and looking at some of the things that Stephen Meyer has developed. There is what's called the Discovery Institute, which is an intelligent design research organization. He is co-founder. His PhD is in the philosophy of science, and he formulated what's known as the intelligent design theory, or helped formulate it. And you will see, we will be having a DVD presentation on December the 5th. You will see him in that presentation. This is the next thing. Here is the intelligent design theory as stated by Stephen Meyer. Okay, so let's take a look at this theory. And I want to point out some important aspects of it. So the theory of intelligent design holds that there are telltale features of living systems and the universe. Okay, these telltale signs are going to point to intelligence, an intelligence cause, or a designer. Notice some of the things that we're going to talk about and what they have expanded upon as far as specific examples of intelligent design. The first one is the universe itself. And of course, Stephen Meyer, his main contribution to intelligent design is what we see right here. Let me see if I can pull up the laser pointer. There it is. Information. What in the living things holds all of the genetic information? Yes? DNA molecule. And the DNA molecule is actually a very sophisticated 4 letters, remember? 4 bases when we talked about mutations, A, T, G, and C. The DNA molecule is actually a digital code using those 4 letters. And it has libraries and libraries full of information. What's the origin of that information? How could that information come into being by random mutations and chance? It's just not possible. So one of the main arguments in the intelligent design movement is, what is the origin of the information found in the DNA molecule? How do we get a sophisticated code, a sophisticated digital code by random chance collisions of molecules? Remember the biochemical roulette that is the supposed source of our biomolecules. So information. So one of the first things that the intelligent design theory centers in on, and the question they ask is, what is the origin of the information found in the DNA molecule? So one of the telltale features of living systems is their DNA. The next telltale feature highlighted by the intelligent design movement is from cell biology. Notice what he says here: the miniature circuits and machines in cells. The cell, inside the cell, is actually like a tiny little city. And there's all kinds of things going on, very complex interactions with molecules and so forth. The person responsible for a lot of this part of their argument is a biochemist from Pennsylvania named Michael Behe. So we're going to be looking at what is the origin of information. We're going to be looking at how did the cell become so complex? Does natural random processes answer those questions? In fact, actually, it's a little bit ridiculous to think that chance could so finely tune the cell and that chance could so finely tune DNA. The next thing, of course, is from physics, the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. These are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than undirected natural causes, which of course is what Darwin taught. Continue his quote on the next slide. The theory does not challenge the idea of evolution. Okay, let's pause for a second here. Most of your intelligent design proponents are not creationists. In fact, they're still evolutionists. They don't have a problem with evolution. Now go back in your mind for a minute and think. Remember we were talking about geology and evolutionary geology? What's the leading theory of evolutionary geology called? From last section. Remember? Yes? Uniformitarianism. And remember, what's the crux of uniformitarianism? Natural processes over time. And then during that section I told you, what's the crux of evolution? What does evolution mean to an evolutionist? It means descent with modification. So most of your intelligent design proponents do not disagree with evolution. They believe that things evolve. They believe in descent with modification. They believe that there is some common ancestor. What they don't believe is that Darwinism, that is mutations and natural selection, is the mechanism of evolution. Though there are intelligent design proponents who are creationists, but they kind of keep that hidden. So you'll notice here, this is Stephen Meyer. He says that the theory of intelligent design does not challenge the idea of evolution, defined as either change over time or common ancestry. So it doesn't dispute it doesn't dispute evolution. What does it dispute? Darwinism. Okay, it does dispute Darwin's idea that the cause of biological change is wholly blind and undirected. Okay, so in here, it's kind of even confusing because they're just being so vague. Look at the next sentence. Either life arose as the result of purely undirected material processes, which Darwin believed, or guiding intelligence played a role. Guiding intelligence. Well, why don't we just come out and say that God is the creator? So design theorists affirm the latter option, meaning they affirm evolution, okay, and argue that living organisms look designed because they really were designed. Okay, well then, who designed them? What's this vague intelligent cause they're referring to? So Stephen Meyer is one of the formulators of this intelligent design theory. Okay, so intelligent design, we can summarize it up in this little quote. Complexity demands design, and information requires intelligence. And one of the main proponents responsible for the idea of complexity is Michael Behe, and the proponent who's very interested in and has spent a lot of research on the origin of information in particular the information in the DNA molecule. That is Stephen Meyer. So complexity demands design, and information requires intelligence. That sounds like a good quiz question, doesn't it? All right, we're going to review. We had a whole section on geology, and we kind of left evolution behind for a few months or a few weeks. And so keep in mind that intelligent design is going to only dispute gradualism or Darwinism. They're only going to dispute the mechanism of how evolution occurred. They're not in disagreement with the idea of evolution. And when I say evolution, remember we have two levels: microevolution, which is variation within kind, and then macroevolution, which is full-scale evolution into different kinds. But when they say evolution, they're talking about descent with modification. They're talking about everything came from a common ancestor. So gradualism is kind of the overall idea of gradual progression over time. And actually, you'll have to keep in mind that the intelligent design proponents, they don't really have a problem with evolution at all. They may not even have a problem with gradualism, but what they have a problem with is Darwinism. They have a problem with natural selection in particular. So the intelligent design proponents are arguing against only the mechanism of evolution, not the idea of evolution. Many of them are still committed evolutionists. And in one sense, they kind of have to be if they're going to be in the secular science community. So gradualism, Darwinism, it's the same idea. Sometimes it's called the Darwinian synthesis or the neo-Darwinian synthesis, where we have mutations and then natural selection selects the best mutations, and these changes accumulate over time. So, and actually, neo-Darwinism is simply updated Darwinism. Because if you remember, Darwin lived in the 1800s and he had no idea about genetics. He did not know about genes. He didn't know about mutations. So what are the 3 steps of gradualism? What is the mechanism that we are going to be disproving or trying to disprove? Step 1 is variation by random mutations. You should recognize these 3. Mutations is the first step in the Darwinian synthesis. We have to have variation. Now remember, Darwin didn't know about mutations. He just called it random variations. But now with neo-Darwinism and the emergence of the whole branch of biology that we call genetics, we know that, they hypothesize that this variation came about through random mutations. Remember, mutations are supposedly the answer to variation and variety. Second step, and the main crux of Darwin's contribution, is natural selection. That's why Charles Darwin is referred to as the icon of evolution, and that's why Charles Darwin is such an important figure in evolutionary history, I guess if you want to call it that, because he gave gradualism a mechanism, which he called natural selection. So first thing that happens is the variation occurs through random mutations, and then natural selection. Natural selection is what Darwin is most famous for. Natural selection then will promote the survival of the altered gene best suited to the environment. Remember, what's another way to put this? Survival of the fittest. And then, of course, these small changes have to accumulate over millions and millions and millions of years. So those are the 3 steps of gradualism or neo-Darwinism. First of all, we have mutations, then natural selection, and then these changes that have been selected will accumulate over time. Okay, so this is what we mean when we're talking about Darwinism or neo-Darwinism or gradualism. Okay, the mutation selection mechanism. And that is the crux of the attack of the intelligent design movement, is that this mechanism does not work. Of course, we know it doesn't too. All right, so the first of the main intelligent design arguments we are going to use is irreducible complexity. This is developed, and in fact, the little phrase, the term irreducible complexity was coined by Michael Behe. Okay, Michael Behe is a biochemist, and we're going to spend a whole day on Michael Behe's, not a whole day, whole lecture. The first thing that this argument deals with, well, you can see what the argument itself is. Living structures and processes are too complicated and sophisticated to be the result of an accumulation of small changes. What Michael Behe has proposed is the idea that natural selection can only select for things that have a function. Does that make sense? It's supposed to be survival of the fittest. So natural selection is going to be blind to changes that have no function. Natural selection is going to be blind to changes that do not occur, that do not give some type of survival advantage. And so we have these sophisticated structures, and we have sophisticated processes in living things that have to evolve all at once. They can't be from an accumulation of small changes, because the small changes have no function, so natural selection is blind to them. And so Michael Behe is calling this idea irreducible complexity. He uses the adjective irreducible because you can't break it down into smaller steps of evolution. Okay, so we can't break down many of the structures we see in the cell and many of the processes that we see in the cell into, there it is, numerous, successive, slight modifications in quotes. Whose quotes? Who said that? Charles Darwin. That's a quote from the book Origin of Species. So Michael Behe says we've got numerous examples in the cell. We have numerous examples in living things of both structures that are highly complex and processes that are highly complex that could not have evolved gradually. They have to be all there all at once. He talks about the bacterial flagellum. Okay, bacteria, supposedly a very simple cell, is not a very simple cell. And some bacteria have a whip-like projection called the flagellum. The flagellum will propel bacteria through fluids, and it's like a propeller. Rotates very, very quickly. And it is a conglomeration of 40 different proteins, or 30 different proteins, depending on how you look at it and which species of bacteria you study. But those 30 to 40 proteins have to have all evolved simultaneously and arrange themselves in exactly a very specific order all at once. So if you just have a few of those proteins around, they're not going to function. So can natural selection choose them as a survival advantage? No, it doesn't make any sense. And not just the bacteria flagellum, but also there's living processes. We'll mention a few of them. They're called cascades. One of the more common ones, and maybe easier ones to understand, is what's called the blood clotting cascade that all of you have in your body. Okay, and it is a series of proteins, and they have to come together and attach in what's called a cascade, which means a sequence. There's a very specific sequence of protein interactions that have to occur in order for your blood to clot, and for your blood to clot properly. If there's a problem with one of those proteins, maybe your blood won't clot, or maybe your blood clots too frequently. Either one, not a very good situation. But that's an example of an irreducible system. All of those proteins had to have evolved simultaneously. All of those proteins are very complex. Okay, so that's irreducible complexity. The idea is that the important word there, of course, is the adjective irreducible. That means we cannot break down many types of living structures into individual, small, gradual changes. And that, of course, would be gradualism. And of course, here's what I've just said, written so you can see it. living structures have to be fully formed and operational to evolve. They cannot be selected for unless they are fully formed and operational. And a lot of the problem here with irreducible complexity is the idea that we can't even figure out what the intermediate steps would be. We certainly don't see any intermediate steps in the fossil record. Now, if you bring that up to an evolutionist as a creationist, they're going to make fun of you, of course, because everybody believes in evolution. We know evolution occurred. Just because we can't figure out how it happened doesn't mean it didn't happen. And you might think, well, think about even the evolution of the wing. All right, is a partial wing going to confer a survival advantage? Well, of course, evolutionists will just brush those arguments off, but they have a harder time brushing off arguments like irreducible complexity when we're talking at such a wide scale, and we're talking at such a highly complex and very sophisticated interaction of proteins or interaction of parts. So irreducible complexity, both living structures and processes are too sophisticated. Okay, that's even a better word than complexity. They're sophisticated, they're complicated. They're sophisticated in the idea that they all have to come together in exactly the right manner at exactly the right time. Evolution cannot explain that. Numerous successive slight modifications cannot be the mechanism of evolution. This, of course, is Michael Behe. The second argument that we're going to borrow from the intelligent design movement is called specified complexity. And this is William Dembski. Another reason why I want you to get a head start on that book report, so that you will be more familiar by reading about it. And this, of course, is also part of Stephen Meyer's contribution, the idea of what is the origin of information. So complex and specified information is produced by intelligent action and thus reliably indicates design. Basically, what we're saying here again is that information requires intelligence. We just said that complexity demands design. That's irreducible complexity argument. Now we're going to say that information is always the product of intelligence. How many have ever heard an illustration of having so many monkeys sitting at typewriters and how long it would take them to type, I don't know, Genesis 1:1, or how long it would take them to type a line from Shakespeare? It just is ridiculous because that's random pounding of typewriter keys. They're not going to be able to write even a sentence. They might get a few simple words here and there, right? I don't know if you're like me and I frequently pocket text people. Okay, and what do my pocket texts look like? Gibberish, okay? So the idea is that if I want to relay information in my text, it requires my intelligence, not the random, putting it in my pocket and the random keys being pressed by the phone falling this way and so forth. Okay, it's ridiculous, but yet it is the accepted theory of biological evolution. It's crazy, okay? So specified complexity has the idea that complex and specified information is produced by intelligence. So information requires intelligence. And this is William Dembski. Couple points here. An object or event. Okay, it's not just structures, it's also processes. So living structures would be synonymous here to the object, and an event would be a process. So it doesn't matter, even if we're talking outside of living structures, even if we're talking about history or archaeology, an object or event is complex if it is unlikely. Okay, so the first qualification for specified complexity is an unlikely or improbable event. And then it's specified if it matches an independent pattern. So when we're talking about being complex, it has to be unlikely that it would come together. And then to be specified means it has to match a recognizable pattern. This is how we read, okay? We recognize patterns, English words, okay? This is William Dembski. So specified complexity allows what he calls an inference to design. So if you look back up at the argument, complex and specified information is produced by intelligent action and thus reliably indicates design. So an indication of design is what Dembski means when he talks about an inference to design. An inference is when you draw a conclusion. So when you see complexity, the conclusion that you draw is that it was designed. When you see the watch, the conclusion or the inference that you make is that somebody made that watch. Somebody designed that. Okay, I'm going to give you a brief history of the intelligent design movement. Again, we're going to spend an entire lecture on both of those arguments. The intelligent design movement, the idea of design is old, but putting it together as a movement and calling it intelligent design is around the late 1980s, early 1990s. And again, these are not creationists, but it came about from a dissatisfaction with what? Evolution itself? No, the mechanism, the mutation selection or Darwinian synthesis. So it is not an argument for creation, it's merely an argument against Darwinism. It's not even an argument against evolution. I want you to I've been stressing that. I want to make sure you understand that idea. So it came from dissatisfaction, disagreement. They're going to refute the mechanism. They're going to refute Darwin or neo-Darwinism. And when I say Darwinism, I'm talking mutation selection. And remember, Darwin, his contribution to evolution is natural selection. He didn't understand about mutations. So it is not a promotion of creation. It is simply a disagreement with the mechanism of evolution, not even the idea of evolution. So here's how it came about. And this makes sense to me, that it grew out of scientific discoveries in three main fields. Biochemistry. Michael Behe is a biochemist. Biochemistry has gotten very sophisticated where we are not just studying chemical reactions, we're studying the molecules involved. We're getting down to the molecular level. Also cell biology. Again, we're going down to the molecular level of what's going on inside cells. Darwin lived in the 1800s. We can kind of excuse Darwin. Darwin had no idea of the complexity of the cell. In Darwin's mind, a cell was simply a blob of cytoplasm, or protoplasm as they called it, encased in a membrane with a nucleus. It's much, much more than that. So we have advancements in biochemistry where we're now studying biomolecules. We're in more detail. We also have cell biology. Also on the molecular level, we're studying exactly how the nucleus produces proteins. At the molecular level, we know the molecules and how they interact. We know the protein sequence of those molecules. And also genetics. Right around the mid-1990s, we had the completion of the Human Genome Project, in that we have completely sequenced the human genome. Now we've completely sequenced the chimpanzee genome and other genomes. So all of this is tremendous advancements in genetics, cell biology, and biochemistry. So now we have a whole new division of biology called molecular biology. So molecular biology is causing all kinds of problems for the mutation selection mechanism of evolution. We just know so much more about how complex things actually are that it's mind-boggling to think it could be the result of mutations and selection. So you might ask yourself, well, how in the world do people believe in it? They kind of have to. They've been conditioned to. You don't question it. You kind of keep your mind focused on your little section of biology, and you don't put two and two together. So what happens is we do have some evolutionary scientists who are starting to think, wait, this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense. And that's kind of how the intelligent design movement began and became more popular in the 1990s. Here are some intelligent design proponents. The first one is, this is Michael Denton. He is an Australian. He kind of kicked off the intelligent design movement with his book. It's called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And his idea is that the Darwinian theory is going to be disproven soon because there's so many things against it, but yet it hasn't been. Why? Well, because what's the alternative? Creationism, and we can't accept creationism. We can't invoke supernatural causes. We're scientists, okay? This is Philip Johnson. You are reading his book, Defeating Darwinism. Philip Johnson is a lawyer. Here's Michael Behe, a biochemist, and this is William Dembski. Okay, so those are a few. We're going to talk about each one briefly. First of all, Michael Denton, 1986. He is a Australian biologist and geneticist. He has a PhD from King's College in London. He right now is a senior fellow at that Discovery Institute that I mentioned with respect to Stephen Meyer. Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And this book actually, as it was read by other scientists, in fact, it influenced Philip Johnson and Michael Behe. Here, he is exposing genetic problems with, not so much with evolution, but with Darwinism, okay? The mutation selection theory does not work from a genetic standpoint, but he doesn't propose an alternate mechanism. Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. So this is Michael Denton. This is the book that kind of started the whole movement. Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. He just published a book this year entitled Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis. All right? And it's amazing that it has not been, that we haven't completely dismissed Darwinism. Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson has a very impressive, I guess some people call it pedigree, but he has a bachelor's from Harvard. He was the top of his legal class. He's a law school graduate from the University of Chicago, top in his class. He was a law clerk for a very famous Supreme Court Justice, Earl Warren. And he held for a long time a very distinguished chair. That means he was a chairman of a department at the University of California, Berkeley, which is kind of amazing too. That's a very liberal college. So there's an interesting story with Philip Johnson. He was on a sabbatical as a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And he took his sabbatical in London. And he happened to walk by a bookstore, as the story goes. And in the bookstore window, he saw two books, Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker and Michael Denton's Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And he was kind of looking around for some type of research project to do during his sabbatical year. And so he was very intrigued by this evolution, creation debate. And so I guess you could say the rest is history. This is when he became an intelligent design proponent. And what's interesting about him is he is not a biologist or a geneticist or a chemist. He's not a scientist. He's a lawyer. So he's using a lawyer's approach, and he's weighing evidence. And in his mind, Darwinism the evidence does not fit Darwinism. So the first book that he wrote once he decided to start researching this, was he wrote Darwin on Trial, which of course fits his profession as a lawyer. Here's something that Philip Johnson has said. The continued dominance of neo-Darwinism is the most important example of distortion and overconfidence resulting from the influence of scientific materialistic philosophy upon the interpretation of empirical evidence. Sounds like a lawyer, huh? But the important thing to see there is that what is Philip Johnson saying that we've already said? What influences your interpretation of empirical evidence? What interprets, I'll give you a hint, your view of science? Your what? Worldview. So he's talking about worldview here. Scientific, materialistic philosophy. So the reason that we're so enamored with evolution is that we don't want to believe the alternative, which is what? Special creation. And you know the implications of being a creationist. It gives God what? Authority. So the whole thing is going to come down to, and even the intelligent design proponents recognize the fact that there's no evidence for evolution. It's all a worldview. They've decided, just like you've decided God's the creator and you live your life accordingly, and of course that makes you Christian and it gives God authority in your life, and there's all kinds of implications of that. Just like that, they are the same as you are. They've decided God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he's not involved in anything. And God didn't create. I don't have to worry about God. I have no responsibility to him. It all goes down to the underlying philosophy. If you're familiar with both ICR, Institute for Creation Research, or Answers in Genesis, you know this is what they say constantly, that we all have the same evidence. We just interpret it differently. And where does that interpretation come? It comes from your worldview. So that's the crux of the whole controversy, is worldview. Here's Michael Behe, PhD in biochemistry. He also read Denton's book, and that kind of started him thinking about it. He never questioned it. He was brought up to, he's a Catholic, and Catholics often are evolutionists. They kind of have a dichotomy in their mind. Their Catholicism is their religious life, and their secular life is separate. And that's the way Michael Behe is. Anyways, he wrote Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. And here he was looking at complexity. He is the one who coined the phrase irreducible complexity. The title of his book is very interesting. This book was came out in 1996. And the black box, according to Michael Behe, is a whimsical term for something that we don't understand. Okay, so it's a whimsical term for a device that does something. We see it on the outside, we know what it does, but its inner workings are mysterious. And so to Darwin, what was Darwin's black box? The cell. The cell. The cell was Darwin's black box. He saw it from the outside. He saw it with very rudimentary microscopic magnification, and to him it was just a very simple thing. And what are we finding out about cells? There is no such thing as a simple cell. So the black box to Darwin was the cell. Okay? He saw the cell, but he had no idea of its inner workings. So we can excuse Charles Darwin. He had no idea of the complexity of life. What's the excuse nowadays? That's Michael Behe, Darwin's Black Box. Here's William Dembski. William Dembski is not a biologist either. He's a mathematician. So he is taking the idea of the origin of this sophisticated digital code that we see in DNA. Okay, DNA is a sophisticated digital code. What is the origin of the information we see? And that complexity, which he called specified complexity, what's the origin of it? What's the probability of that information coming together? So he's a mathematician. He is looking at the argument from the standpoint of probability. He's a mathematician. So I'm interested in you paying attention to Philip Johnson. What's he? He's a lawyer. He wrote Darwin on Trial. How is he approaching the argument? as a lawyer. He's looking at evidence. He's weighing evidence. That's Philip Johnson. He's a lawyer. He's weighing the evidence, and his mind, evolution, in particular Darwinism, comes up wanting. So Philip Johnson, he's a lawyer. He's looking at evidence. He wrote Darwin on Trial. Then we have Michael Behe. He is a biochemist, and he is looking at it from the idea of complexity. Think about the title of that book, Darwin's Black Box. Inside the cell is so complex it couldn't possibly have evolved through numerous successive slight modifications. Think about his argument. Think about what he called it. He called it irreducible complexity, in that you can't take a sophisticated living structure, you can't take a sophisticated process that occurs in a living cell and break it down into little steps that evolved one at a time. That's his argument. Those structures cannot have evolved one at a time. Why not? Because selection only acts on things that have a function. So if you have these proteins, for example, everything's based on proteins because DNA codes for proteins. How can we have all these proteins coming together one at a time? They'll be selected against. Natural selection only can choose or select something that has a function. So how can we have all these complex things coming together? We can't. They are irreducible. That's Michael Behe. He's a biochemist. So he's looking at the molecules. He's looking at proteins. He's looking at complexity. Cannot be broken down. We can't even imagine what those steps could be. And so, according to Darwin, the whole driving force of evolution is what? Natural selection. So if natural selection is the whole driving force of evolution, and it can't choose all these numerous successive slight modifications, it kind of cancels itself. Do you see that? The mechanism cancels itself. Because according to the first step, we have all these small, gradual changes. And then natural selection has to select them. Well, they don't function. Natural selection cannot select them. That's what Michael Behe is saying. That's what he means by irreducible. Okay, and then we have William Dembski. Keep in mind, he is what? A mathematician. He is dealing with probability. So William Dembski, he is responsible for what we're calling the specified complexity argument. He's an American mathematician from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He has a BA in psychology, an MS in statistics, a PhD in philosophy, a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Chicago. He also has a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. Okay, so we're not talking about Joe on the street here. Okay, and that's why I do want you to try to get that book read. And he is one of the authors of your book report. All right, the goal of the intelligent design movement is to show that neo-Darwinism, remember that's the mechanism, is impossible and illogical from a strictly scientific point of view. That's why I like a lot of their arguments. They're showing that it's impossible and illogical to think that natural selection works as a mechanism. That's the whole crux here. That's what the intelligent design movement attacks. Natural selection as a mechanism. It's illogical. It's impossible to even imagine the in-between steps. How in the world can natural selection be the driving force of evolution when it doesn't work? It's illogical. That would be Philip Johnson and Stephen Meyer. It's impossible. That would be William Dembski. He's the mathematician. Okay, it's from a scientific standpoint. That's why they go overboard in not saying who their designer is. All right, so the ID proponents will not mention who the designer is because they don't want to be viewed like us. A religious fanatic Bible thumper. If you saw the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the so-called science guy, what was he doing the whole time? He was making fun of the state of Kentucky. wasn't he? He was making fun of Ken Ham. By the way, it's kind of interesting. Ken Ham and Bill Nye the Science Guy both have the same level of education. Neither one of them has a PhD. And you'd think that they both have very similar backgrounds as far as their education goes. So we will not mention the designer on purpose. And as you watch the DVD presentation in December, it's almost comical how they're sidestepping that issue. Most are not creationists, or if they are, we don't know about it. They still believe in evolution. Keep in mind, they are not attacking the idea of common ancestry. They're not attacking descent with modification. They're attacking the how. They're attacking the mechanism. Okay, they don't disagree with evolution itself, the idea of evolution, descent with modification. And all of them that I know of view the earth as being billions of years old. Maybe not William Dembski. I'm not sure about him. But I think most of them, if not all of them, if they are creationists, they would be old earth creationists. The focus of the movement, I feel like I've said this 1,000 times in this lecture. Here's the focus. But I figured if I didn't put it on the slide, you wouldn't write it down. That's the downside of PowerPoint. Okay, what's the focus? We're attacking natural selection and gradualism. Because according to Michael Behe, we can't reduce these structures or these processes in the living cell down to gradual steps. Those steps do not exist. The whole process has to be intact and functioning for natural selection to choose it. Or the whole structure has to be fully formed and functional, or it will be selected against, meaning it will not evolve. Does that make sense? Here's Philip Johnson again. The claims that natural selection is a force of stupendous creative power. It's kind of funny they even use the word creative power, which is capable of crafting the immensely complex biological structures that living things possess in such abundance. And it's not supported by what? Evidence. Who's Philip Johnson? He is a lawyer. He is looking at it from the standpoints of evidence. So he's saying that natural selection is not supported by evidence or observation. Okay, so observational evidence, there's the famous peppered moth study that they love so much, evolutionists love so much, shows mainly cyclical changes in the relative frequency of characteristics. Notice, those characteristics are already present. DNA itself is a fascinating molecule. We still don't know exactly how it stores all the information and how it works. Okay, and so when we see those black peppered moths, or we see variety within species, all it is characteristics that are already present in that DNA. It's already there. So it's not a way to explain evolution. Here's again, the focus of the intelligent design movement is against natural selection. It's not for creation. Everybody understands that, right? Okay, so we still hold to common ancestry and descent with modification. And we still will not say who the designer is. That's why we find this movement offensive, even though I like their arguments. And of course, the closest they get to talking about who the designer is talking about who the designer isn't. They criticize evolutionists for replacing God with natural selection, but they won't call him God. They'll call him the designer. So in their mind, in our mind, natural selection is their God that's replaced the creator. In the mind of an intelligent design proponent, natural selection is the designer's substitute. That's as close as they get. Okay? We would agree with them, but we don't call it the designer substitute. We call it the replacement for God. 3 steps of gradualism, you must know them, because if we're going to attack gradualism, you must know the 3 steps. Second slide. So what does that mean to you? That you better know it. And here's where I want to conclude today with shortcomings of the intelligent design movement. I do like their arguments. I like all the science and all the complexity, and I like the fact that this is very strong evidence from science against gradualism, against evolutionists. But I want you to know that we should be offended by the intelligent design movement as a Christian. Why should we be offended by them? And why do we not jump on their bandwagon, even though I'm having you read 2 books by them, because I think their arguments are very good. But as a Christian, keep in mind that it's only a critique of Darwinism, in particular the mechanism of natural selection. It's not a promotion of creation. All right, so I'm not going to go and join the Discovery Institute, am I? It is offensive because it leaves out God, it rejects Genesis, it rejects the Bible. It is not Christian in any way, shape, or form. Another problem with it is it doesn't present an alternate theory, which doesn't make sense from a lawyer's standpoint. He should be presenting an alternate theory. They're not going to go there. And it doesn't deal with the purpose behind creation. Remember, we're going to call this section of this class creative design, because we're very interested in the purpose of creation. We said that, yes, God's hand is obvious in nature. That was our first point in the creative design argument. God's hand is obvious in nature. But the second thing is that God's design fulfills purpose, and purpose on multiple levels. So it doesn't deal with the purpose behind creation. They're still embracing naturalism because they won't name the designer. And they certainly will not have anything to do with us. So it's offensive. So a Christian view of the intelligent design movement. It's contrary to a Christian's purpose. What is our purpose? Our purpose is to win the lost, right? And I really think that Answers in Genesis does a good job with keeping it focused on the gospel and keeping it focused on God. It's contrary to our purpose. Keep in mind that winning arguments about origins does not win souls, does it? And our purpose is to be soul winners and bring people to Christ. So you're not fulfilling your purpose if all you're doing is winning arguments. That's not your purpose, to convince people of creation. It's also contrary to our position. It's offensive to us because God is the designer and they are not giving him any credit. They're ignoring him. And of course, one of our purposes is to bring God glory and praise and honor. So it's contrary to our position as Christians. So you should be offended by their approach to origins. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to use their science. Okay? So the intelligent design movement, I gave you a lot of information today, and we are going to use their arguments. And I'm going to show you one of their DVD presentations, which will help you understand their arguments after we've presented them in class. But keep in mind that the intelligent design movement is not Christian. It goes against our position and against our purpose. There we go. Cool picture to end the day with.